views and opinions expressed by the host, guest, and callers to your turn aren't necessarily those of News Talk 1430 KASI. Now, it's your turn. Here's Trent Rice.
Good Wednesday afternoon. It is your turn on News Talk 1430 KASI. Trent Rice here until 2 o'clock. Coming up at the bottom of the hour, we will talk about last night's Republican presidential debate. We will first be joined by, on the Newsmaker line, Steve Winzenburg is a professor of communications at Grandview College. We're talking about the announcement yesterday that Moral Majority founder, longtime televangelist. I wanted to say television preacher, but that sounds a little disrespectful, and not that I mean to. Jerry Falwell passed away yesterday at the age of 73. Steve, thanks for taking the time, sir. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Trent. It's great to be on with you again.
Hey, good to hear from you. No question that in terms of, at least let's just start with the televangelist movement. There's really no question that not only was Jerry Falwell really a pioneer, but he was a giant.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because in some of the reports that I've been seeing, they've tended to play down the TV preacher part and talk a lot about his political comments. And he certainly was involved in politics and certainly wanted to try to change culture. But over the past 25 years that I've studied TV preachers, he would be up in the top 5 or 7, I would say, in terms of the influence over the past 25 years or so.
Now, he wasn't certainly the first one to do this. I mean, the religious folks out there realized pretty quickly, Steve, that a great way to get out the message, I mean, big M message and little m message, that TV was a great vehicle for that.
Yeah. Billy Graham and Oral Roberts were basically the first big ones back in the 50s to do it. But Jerry Falwell had a little different take on it, because he's very old-fashioned. His show is called the Old Time Gospel Hour. And his idea was just to take his Virginia church service and actually televise it on the air. So all you basically saw in his show every Sunday was the choir singing and then him getting up and preaching a long sermon. That was pretty much all there was to it. So he really didn't use television the same way some other preachers did by trying to do modern entertainment shows. It took him a while to kind of catch up with everybody else. But then by the 90s, he started to lose some of the public attention. And then he started to adapt a little bit and started to do some more modern shows. He got his own satellite cable network, and gradually he changed. But he was probably the last one to adapt the modern methods.
Now, how much of what you said that, by the 90s that he started maybe losing a little ground, was this, because this was, if I'm not mistaken, didn't Mr. Falwell, or Reverend Falwell, take over the PTL after Jim and Tammy Baker, after that scandal broke?
You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, it was about 20 years ago right now that he took over PTL. The PTL scandal happened in 1987, and he took it over a couple of months after the scandal occurred, which was March of 1987. And so it's about 20-year anniversary right now. So that was probably his last hurrah from a popular standpoint, because he had already gone through the moral majority phase. He had already helped influence the 1980 presidential election with Ronald Reagan. But people were incredibly skeptical of him, especially the non-Christian viewers and non-Christian readers who would hear some of his comments and really roll their eyes at some of the things he was saying. So he was starting to lose influence by the late 80s, and then some people say that he actually betrayed Jim Baker by stealing PTL from Jim Baker, and that kind of was the last big thing that he did. And then, of course, the moral majority broke up, and he tried to do other things years after that, but he never quite achieved the same power and influence that he did back in the 80s.
But he always had what started as really just kind of a course of instruction for Bible scholars that later became Liberty University.
That's right.
He had a firm home there.
Yeah, he liked education, and he continued to his death to do a lot of correspondence courses. One of the things I complained most about him is that he was kind of a born salesman. He loved to sell. So he would get on TV and do infomercials for his home Bible correspondence course. He thrived on that. He loved that. He loved to try to use his great oratory skills to convince people to buy into his correspondence school. So you didn't have to actually go to Liberty University. You could just do it at home.
And there are a lot of people out there who got certified degrees. I mean, counselors. There are a lot of counselors out there who got their certification through that very course, right?
Well, I think his original goal was to build up Liberty University as this gigantic Notre Dame-like school. He always said he wanted Liberty University to be the Notre Dame of evangelical Christianity. But at some point it plateaued when people started to be skeptical of him, and it dropped off, and it's pretty much leveled off now. But he then turned to television to try to sell this correspondence school, and that helped the numbers go up then. But those people are not actually in Virginia.
Steve, what will his mark be? I mean, what is he going to be known for? I mean, I realize that your view on this may be different coming from the role of communications as to somebody in the theology or anything like that, but or even political science, which I do want to talk about a little bit. But what is his role? Is he the one who kind of mainstreamed televangelism?
No,
if you could say that.
I think what you're seeing through all of the tributes to him right now, you're seeing the emphasis on politics and also on some of his cultural criticism. I think that's what the general public is going to remember him for. They're going to remember him as being a person who tried to sway followers to a political viewpoint, basically right-wing conservatism. And then they're also going to see him as a person who made some bumbling statements after September 11th or about the Teletubbies or something like that. But those are just very small, media-driven clips of him. That's not a whole picture of Jerry Falwell. I haven't really seen any discussion about him as a salesman, him as a business leader, him as really as a TV personality, because at one point he had higher ratings than Phil Donahue. So
wow.
Phil Donahue was big time back in the 70s. So he did have a huge influence in other areas, but it tends to not be the things that we're remembering him for. And also as an educator probably as well.
And I know that he is, I've heard and read lots in the last 24 hours after his death that, he would show up in, at Liberty University. He was still teaching. He would show up at football games. And right. I guess he was kind of a rock star when he would show up at Liberty University football games. But that education seemed to be, I guess, like I said earlier, really kind of where he found his home there over the last few years.
That was really his love. His love was to try to train, he'd use the phrase, to train young warriors for Christ. So he saw education as an opportunity to train these people to go out into the secular, humanistic world and try to battle the culture, all the changes that were going on. Years ago, that meant kids had to dress a certain way. You had to be very careful how you dressed at Liberty University. You weren't allowed to watch certain movies, or in some cases, you weren't allowed to go to movies at all back in the early days. And now, gradually over the years, some of those things have been relaxed. So now, more recently, instead of telling them they couldn't do things, he'd say, we want you to go out and change culture, and instead, let's make Christian movies. Let's do things that are going to change culture.
Well, here's a guy who said, essentially, we are a Christian nation.
Yeah.
I mean, he really didn't make really any bones about that fact.
Right.
Steve, I need to take a break, but when we come back, let's talk for a second about the role that he played not only in communication but also in politics as the moral majority, because he was really the first religious leader who crossed that divide. Steve Winzenburg, a professor of communication at Grandview College who has written extensively about televangelism. We will pick up the conversation right after this. It is your turn. Steve, it was really, as I see it, and let me get your take on this, certainly as somebody who studied this issue, it seems that it was really Jerry Falwell with the founding of the moral majority and then kind of disbanding that organization, coming back then with the Christian Coalition. He was really the one to really cross that divide between religious fundamentalism and politics. It really was with him.
Right. Of course, historically in our country, we've always had Christian fundamentalists that have been interested in influencing politics.
Right.
But he's more the modern media age pioneer. He's the one who figured out that he could use a well-oiled PR machine along with TV time to galvanize a variety of his followers from across the nation and help them to vote a certain way. So as much as some people cringe at just the idea of the moral majority, he did bring people together and prove that it could impact an election. And of course, the most obvious one was Ronald Reagan's election in 1980.
And that's an interesting story because the Reverend Falwell had actually supported in 1976, had supported another man of strong Christian faith, Jimmy Carter. Here's a guy who in 76 he supported, but by 1980, had really turned the corner on Jimmy Carter completely. Talk about that,
Right,
Steve.
and if there's an impetus for the founding of the moral majority, it was basically because of Jimmy Carter's failure as a president to take the Christian agenda and implement it within the White House. Falwell supported Carter because he was a Christian Southern Baptist, and yet when Carter got into office, he made decisions that were not popular among the Christian community. And very much like Bill Clinton would do 20 years later, because Bill Clinton also is Southern Baptist, didn't basically carry the Christian agenda into the White House, and so Falwell in 1979 formed a moral majority to counter that and basically get somebody elected who would take the Christian agenda into the White House. And it's ironic that it would be Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan's past has things in it that normally someone like Falwell wouldn't support, such as a divorce or some of the political situations he was involved in because he used to be Democrat. But in this case, Reagan ended up being a great choice for Falwell and his supporters and ended up implementing some of the things that he wanted.
Well, and for whatever people might say about his politics and specifics, Ronald Reagan, this just in, wasn't a dummy. I mean, he realized in 1980, kind of like I think George W. Bush recognized in 2000, that you could find a pretty receptive well of votes if you kind of, I don't want to say tailored yourself to Christian conservatives, but if you began to embrace some of their leadership, adopt some of their platforms, there was a wellspring of voters out there who were really left, before 1980, who really didn't have a home.
Right, and I think Reagan probably tolerated Falwell. I wouldn't suggest that they were chummy, but at the same time, he loved the support that he was getting from Falwell and his followers.
And that really carried through. I mean, it really is kind of hand in hand where you see really the rise in televangelism. Steve, you mentioned it had been out there as long as television, really. But this is where it really started to kind of come into its own, at least as I see it, with Falwell, with Oral Roberts, with PTL, with the 700 Club and Pat Robertson.
And then, of course, Robertson, followed up on what Falwell did, and then Robertson formed his own group and then ran for president himself. And by that time, Falwell then was behind the scenes. He really wasn't a major player anymore, which is interesting that Robertson's the one who actually took the whole focus away from Falwell and the moral majority.
And the listeners, I was telling the listeners yesterday, I saw a special on Frontline that aired in 2004, and it was really Pat Robertson and the success he had really in Iowa in 1988 that really kind of gave, at least their impression was, George W. Bush, that wasn't all lost on him. He realized that as somebody who was a born-again Christian, that he could kind of capitalize on Robertson's message and take it not only to the governor's office in Texas, but certainly to the White House.
I think there is something we need to mention about Falwell, though, that I don't think gets portrayed very often, and that's that he had a great sense of humor, and he did get along with opponents. We tend to see him as kind of this bully who's pushing his weight around, and yet I went to a convention, a religious broadcasters convention back in the late 80s, where Falwell and Ted Kennedy were on stage together. They were friends. They ended up talking about how they had spent time together. Falwell had been up at the Kennedy compound, staying for the weekend. I was dumbfounded because this was a side of Jerry Falwell that I really didn't know about.
Steve, the phrase Lion's Den comes into mind here.
But he did that also, with the Hustler magazine thing and Larry Flynt. Yeah. Those two were so opposed to each other in the court, and yet later on, they actually had a relationship together and spent time together. Yeah,
so, there was a, and I'm sorry, Steve, not to cut you off, but I need to now demonstrate my prowess in broadcasting school when I mentioned Hustler or Jerry Falwell versus Hustler magazine. This is a Supreme Court case, folks, that kind of defined what the limits were for somebody in the public eye or somebody who was a celebrity and being able to sue for libel, which is kind of where that whole, or for slander, which is where that whole thing kind of rested. In fact, I read this, Larry Flynt actually released a statement yesterday. And, of course, he released it to Access Hollywood, so fill in your own punchlines there, folks. He said, the Reverend Jerry Falwell, let me try that again. The Reverend Jerry Falwell and I were arch enemies for 15 years. We became involved in a lawsuit concerning First Amendment rights and Hustler magazine without question. This was my most important battle. My mother always told me no matter how much you dislike a person, when you meet them face to face, you will find characteristics about them you like. Jerry Falwell was a perfect example of that. I hated everything he stood for, but after meeting him in person years after the trial, Jerry Falwell and I became good friends. Right. He would visit me in California, and we would debate together on college campuses. I can't even work my mind around that, Steve.
It's hard to believe that, isn't it? It's kind of like when I saw Falwell and Kennedy, I just thought, how is this possible? But he did have a charm when he was off camera. When the cameras turned on or the microphones were on, he was one type of person. When the cameras were off, he was much more charming and willing to compromise and get along with people.
Well, from students and former students at Liberty University, and what I read and heard yesterday, they all kind of echoed that, Steve, that he was very personable, that he would be walking around campus, would come into, where guys would be sitting around eating lunch or things like that, would sit and just kind of shoot it for a little while.
Yeah. I do have a comparison, and I don't know if this is a good comparison. I was trying to think of who is Jerry Falwell like, and the best I could come up with, believe it or not, you're going to probably squawk about this, is Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump is very blustery, egotistical, he's a self-promoter. He likes to verbally put other people down in public, like his fights with Rosie O'Donnell or Martha Stewart. But he also was a person who could get along with other people and get things done. Trump has his agenda and pushes forward his agenda, just like Falwell had an agenda and pushed it forward. But he knew that in order to become successful, he had to be able to get along with other people. So even though his public image was blustery, off stage he actually had some type of charm.
Well, and there's also a certain, and you said this earlier, there is also a certain salesman quality to both of them. I mean, they both very much know how to, in obviously the Reverend Falwell's case, it was social issues, political issues, and obviously religious issues. With Donald Trump, it's pretty much anything with his name on it, but they both knew how to sell the product they were promoting.
Right. And I think the one regret probably Jerry Falwell has going to his grave is that he's being remembered for political things and not Christian things. He really wanted to spread the gospel. He really wanted to be a warrior for Christ. And yet what happened is his words tripped him up and people started to focus on the silly things that he said. He was a great orator. He had a great strength and a great gift in his speaking ability, but his great strength also was his great weakness. And that sometimes he said things that ended up taking him off on a tangent.
Well, and Steve, you mentioned this in regards to what he said in the days after September 11th. He put the blame for those attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on kind of the moral life, or immoral life, I guess, as he would put it, that we were leading, blaming homosexual agendas, feminism, abortion, all those things, as opposed to the radical Muslims who flew the planes into the buildings. He caught a lot of flack for that. And a lot of people are going to say, Stephen, let me get your take on this, that he never really recovered from that.
Yeah, I think that was probably the final blow. He had a hard time recovering just from the Teletubbies thing, and that was a simple little statement. So if you can't recover from the Teletubbies, you're sure as heck not going to recover from a September 11th statement like that. So he had lost credibility. One thing many of your listeners may not be aware of is back in the 80s, at the peak of his success and the peak of the televangelism scandals back in the late 80s, they did a survey in America, a poll of the most hated people in history. Jerry Falwell came in second to Hitler.
Wow.
As the most hated person in history. I'm serious. It's in one of my books, and it's absolutely amazing to me that people would equate Falwell with Hitler, because he really was not that type of person. He was a person with a great heart who really wanted to spread the gospel. He just did a really poor job by being too blunt and being too pushy. And so that's what we remember him for.
Well, and I heard this somewhere yesterday, and I can't remember where, but as part of his ministry, especially early on in the early days of Liberty University, which then I think there's a high school down there with the same, I think it's Liberty High School in Virginia, but Falwell and his ministries opened up homes for unwed mothers, did all sorts of outreach. But it is, Steve, it is kind of it's that outreach part that we don't really like to focus on. It's not nearly sexy enough.
I will say that a skeptic would say, Trent, that he opened those initially because he was reacting to the flack he was getting. He was very anti-abortion, and people would call him on it. Democrats would say, hey, if you're really concerned about life, then you should be taking care of unwed mothers. And so finally he took the bait. He said, okay, I will, and he did. So you have to give him credit for it, but at the same time, his initial reason for doing it was to fight off the criticism.
So, Steve, we need to get out of here. We've got a news break coming up at the bottom of the hour, and we certainly need to let you get back to your life. But let's talk about this. What is ultimately his legacy? I mean, certainly a man of strong conviction, a man of strong faith, and a guy who wasn't really all that afraid of a fight, it seemed like.
Well, his legacy in the secular standpoint is obviously going to be the moral majority. He formed a group that tried to push through an agenda, and some people saw it as being a negative group, and they didn't even like the name of it. His legacy within the Christian community, I think, is one who tried really hard to serve God, but had his weaknesses, just as any person does, and probably detracted from the message that he really was trying to put across. But ultimately, he served God the way he thought he should.
Steve, we appreciate it if we do that.
Thanks a lot, Trent. Great talking to you.
Steve Winzenburg is a communications professor at Grandview College in Des Moines and has written extensively and done studies in regards to, frankly, the TV preacher. Talking about Jerry Falwell today. We'll take your phone calls when we come back. We'll also talk a little politics. It's your turn on a Wednesday right here on 1430 KASI. Hang on.